Hey all, and welcome to a new Programming the Net tutorial. In our previous video, we looked at how to intercept click events from HTML with JavaScript and perform certain actions when those events happen. And in this video, we're going to look at a slightly different JavaScript event, which is the mouse move event, right? So JavaScript allows us to intercept whenever the user is moving their mouse on screen and perform whatever actions we want with that. So we're going to implement kind of the loading screen that we see on Glitch when a project is starting up, right? So you move the mouse and various circles appear on the screen at the position of the mouse. Yeah, we're going to start with that and then make it even cooler. So let's see where we get. I'm starting with an empty glitch project as usual. I just kept the style sheet and the script inclusions in the head of our page, and then the script is empty, the style is empty, and we're going to start from here. I'm going to start by creating a div inside of our body, which is kind of going to be the container for our movement. So I'll do a div. I'll give it an ID from the beginning because we're going to need to get it from JavaScript. So I'll just call it container. And I'm going to give it a class. Let's say movement. Oh gosh, I can't spell today. Movement. Wow. Container. And I'm going to close the div, and let's first go ahead to CSS and style it. Before doing that, let's open the window. Let's open the page. So let's see, movement container. Maybe I should give it a different name. This is so hard to spell. And I'm just going to give it a width of, I'll just say 100 viewport width, a height of 100 viewport height, and I'm gonna make it position fixed, right? So I just kind of want it to take over the entire page. And in order to see it, I'm going to give it a background color as well, and I'm gonna make it gray. Very cool. So we have our container. You see it's actually not taking over the entire page. There's a little border at the top and on the left side. That's because the body itself has a margin by default in HTML. So I'm just going to remove that margin. So I'll create a style for the body and I'll say margin 0. And that should make our div actually take over the entire screen. All right, very cool. So we have a div, and what we want to do is to intercept the mouse movements on this div and create new HTML elements kind of at every single position of the mouse as it's moving. So in order to do that, I'm going to go to script.js. As usual, I'm going to write the DOM content loaded event listener, so we start adding our code only after the page has loaded. So window add event listener DOM content loaded, and then our function which gets executed once the page is loaded and where we write all of our code. So first we want to get our div, right, in order to be able to add the event listener, the mouse move event listener to it. So I'm going to create a variable var container element equals document get element by ID for the container. All right, so far so good, nothing new. And now I'm going to add the event listener for the mouse movement. So just like for the click, the syntax is container element add event listener. The name of the event is mouse move. Right, so in the previous tutorial we looked at the click event, now we're learning mouse move, and then we have to give it a function which will get executed when our mouse is moving on top of the element that we've selected. So I'll just call it on mouse move. Right, Glitch is complaining that the function doesn't exist quite yet, so we need to create a function on mouse move. We're going to give it again one argument, which is the event that JavaScript is giving us. This is kind of the case for all events that we're getting from JavaScript, right? We're getting some information about that event. And for now, let's just print a message to the console to make sure that our event listener is working. So we'll just say mouse moved. All right, and I'm going to clear my console. And you see it's only showing up once in the console, but then you see a little blue indicator with a large number, like a 200 something inside of it. That means that message has been printed that many times. So every time I move my mouse, the message gets printed again. So the event listener is working, which is great. Before we move forward though, let's take a look at the event that is coming to us. All right, so I've moved a bunch and let's open one of these. So we see a bunch of different properties in here. What we want to use for our for creating our kind of like drawing on the screen, just like Glitch does, we sort of need to find the position of the mouse at every point of movement in order to be able to draw an element at that exact position, right? And we're lucky that the event is giving us exactly those positions inside of the client X and client Y properties, right? So client X is telling us how many pixels from the left of the container that we attach the listener to the mouse is, and client Y is giving us the exact same information of like how many pixels from the top of the container our mouse is at. There are a few similar properties inside of mousemove. For example, page X and page Y, which I think has to do with scrolling. Like if our page was longer and we were to scroll, page X and page Y would take into account all of the pixels above the page. There's screen X and screen Y, which gives us the actual coordinates on the entire screen of the computer rather than inside of the container that we attach the event listener to. However, for now, we're just going to work with client X and client Y. So let's first print those two numbers to the console and kind of see a stream of all of the positions that the mouse is at. So I'm going to say event.clientX and then also console log event.clientY. So I'm going to clear the console, and now we just see a bunch of numbers, which is kind of what we're expecting. If we go to the top left corner, we should be seeing 0, 0, or like close to 0, 0. It seems like I can't really get to the top left because of the resizing cursor. And then, as we move to the right, the X would increase and the Y would be close to 0. And if we move to the bottom, the Y would increase and the X would be 0 or close to 0. Right, so it's just like an X or Y plane with these coordinates. And what we want to do every time this event is called is to create an HTML element like a circle like Glitch does and place it on the page at that position. And we're going to do that in this function. I'm just going to create a new variable, let's say circle, or just move element equals document create element. We've done this in a previous tutorial, so it shouldn't be new information. We're going to create a div for now. And now we kind of have to style it. I'm just going to style it inline here as opposed to creating a class and writing the style in CSS. So I'm going to say move element. Let's start by giving it a width and a height and the background color so we can see what we're doing. So move element dot style for width is equal to, let's say, 20 pixels. I'll do the same thing for height, so we're just gonna have squares on the page for now, 20 pixels, and I'm also gonna give it a background color so we can see our movement. So move element dot style for background color equals, let's say, yellow. Right, so now if I hover my mouse over the page, we should already start seeing some stuff. But we are not. Oh, and that's because we've created the element, but we forgot to add it to the page, right? So right now the element exists kind of in the ether in JavaScript, but it's not actually added to our page. So we should make sure to do that. And also we forgot the most important thing, which is positioning the element on the page, right? Like we gave it a width, we gave it a height, we gave it a color, but we didn't tell it where on the page to go. So let's start with that. Let's start with positioning. In order to position it, I think I'm just going to do position fixed and then give it a top attribute and the left attribute. And that's just going to place it on the page wherever we want. So I'm going to say move element dot style for position is fixed. So remember, position fixed means where on the screen this should be, right? So if the page is scrolling down, the position fixed is going to keep the element static at the same place on the screen, regardless of the scroll. And then move element style left, right? So this is the number of pixels that it should, the number of pixels between the element and the left border of the page. And for that, we need to use the event client X, right? So that's exactly the same metric for where the mouse is. So I'm just going to say event.client X, which is a number, and then I'm going to add the pixel string at the end of it, because CSS wants its units, its measurement units as well. Weird thing in JavaScript as opposed to C++, if you can totally add a number and a string, and the result is going to be converted to a string, which is very convenient. And then we're going to do the same thing for the top attributes, but we're going to use the client Y property of the event. So move element style top equals event.client Y plus pixels. Alright, and now let's also add the element to our page. In order to do that, we can simply add it to the body, I think. We don't necessarily need to add it to the container. So I can just say document.body, right, which gives us the body. We don't need to do get element by ID or anything, because body is kind of at the top. And then append child, which we've seen before. And the child that we want to append to the body is move element. Okay, so now if I hover my mouse over the page, we should start seeing our squares, right? So one thing to notice here is that the slower I move my mouse, the closer together the squares are. However, when I start moving my mouse really fast, we see a lot of spacing in between the squares. And that's kind of just how JavaScript fires these movement events, right? And like one reason that's useful, right, to have the events fire very close apart when you're moving slowly and kind of spread out when you're moving fast, is, for example, if you need to determine the speed of the mouse movement. We're not going to do that in this tutorial, but the way one would go about determining the speed is by keeping track of the current event and the previous event and determining the distance between those two, right? So if the distance between the current event and the previous event is really large, that means the user is moving their mouse super quickly. If the distance is small, that means they're moving their mouse slowly. Okay, so we're slowly getting there, right? We have the same idea that glitch has when a page is loading. Let's make it a little bit more interesting visually. So one thing that they're doing is that they're turning these squares into circles, so we could do that as well. And the way to turn squares into circles is by giving them a border radius. So I'm just going to say move element dot style for border radius. And in order to make them a circle and not just squares with rounded corners, the border radius needs to be equal to half of the square width. So I'm going to say 10 pixels. Right, so now we have circles, which is great. However, it's still kind of boring. It's the same color all over the place. So one other kind of fun thing we could do would be to change the color of the circles based on where we are on the page, right? So if we are at the very left, it should be one color, and then it should like kind of slowly transition into a different color if we're on the right side. Same thing for top and down. And the way we could do that is by, again, using the client X and client Y properties of the event. We know that client X and client Y are expressed in pixels, right? So if our page is kind of narrow, like the one we have in this example, client X is going to go from 0 to, I don't know, maybe like 200, 300 pixels, or however wide our page is. However, if we were to open our page in a new window, right, or if it was a different screen size, then that number would change, right? It would go up to 1,000 or 2,000, or depending on, or a different number depending on how big of a screen the user has. And colors only go from 0 to 255. So we need to map this position of the mouse into a number from 0 to 255. Oh gosh, I lost my tab. Oh yeah, it's here. Great. Okay, so the way we could do that is if we take the client X of the event, right? So the position of the mouse on the page, and divide it by the window width, right? That would give us a number between 0 and 1. Right, where the top left, the left side of the window is going to be 0, and then the right side of the window is going to be 1. So I'm going to start by creating a variable. I'll just call it red color is equal to, and I'll say event client X. And in order to get the window width, we use the window object, not with the window. That we discussed in a previous tutorial, and then there's a property on it called inner width, which gives us exactly what we need. Right, so this turns our mouse position into a number from 0 to 1, and now we just need to multiply it with 255 in order to get a number that would be a valid color. Right, so multiply by 255. And let's print this to the console. I'm going to remove the previous console log, and I'll just print console log red color. And we're gonna do a similar thing for the blue component of the color, but for the vertical axis, right? For event.clientY and window height. So let's clear this out. Right, so if we're on the left side of the image, we see, yeah, small number 6, 7, and then as we move right, we're in the kind of in the middle now, so we see like 124, 125, and when we're all the way right, we see things close to 255. So that's good enough for now. Let's do the same thing. I'll just say red color component. And then we'll do the same thing for the green color component for the client Y. Green color component equals event client Y over window inner height, and again multiplied by 255. All right, and then we're going to move the background color down here and create a different color based on the red and the green components. We're going to do that by using, if you remember, the RGBA CSS function, right, which allows us to specify red, green, blue, and alpha components of our color, right? And we're just going to replace this 255 with the red color component and the 128 with the green color component. One more thing we need to do before being able to do that is making sure these components are integer numbers, not floats, right? So this division and multiplication will give us a float number. CSS wants integer numbers. So I'm going to use the math.round function, which just rounds the floats to the closest integer. So math.round for the entire expression, and do the same here, math.round. And then all we need to do is to compose them into this RGBA thing. So I'm going to remove this, and we'll say RGBA open parenthesis plus red color component, close parenthesis, no, not close parenthesis, sorry, comma, plus green color component plus comma. And then we don't have a variable for the blue color component, so we're just going to make the blue a static color. Let's just make it 255, right? Make everything very blue. And then we also need to give it an alpha and opacity, which I'm going to make 1 for now, and then close the parentheses. So now we should see our color changing as we move from left to right, right? So the very top left should be 0 or like close to 0 red, close to 0 green, and 255 blue, so it's going to be very blue. As we move to the right, the red component increases, so we're getting to full red and full blue, which kind of creates this pink. As we go down, we start getting some green as well, right? So down bottom bottom left should be a lot of green with blue, which gives us this like light blue. And then as we go towards the bottom right, we should be getting closer to white, right? Like all three components are getting close to 255. Right, so now we have this really cute drawing app that draws gradients for us, which is kind of fun. However, I think we can make this even more interesting by kind of changing the size of our circles at each step, right? Like right now it's the same kind of circle every time. It's 20 pixels. We could make that, we could create some variation in that. And let's first try it out with a smaller size and see what that looks like. Let's say 5. Right, so now we just have smaller circles that are being drawn on the screen with the same kind of gradient. If we make them unequal, right, so we make 1.5 and 1.50. We're drawing with rectangles, which is also kind of interesting. Yeah, but I want the sizes to change for different places on the page. And one way to do that, and this is a pretty common approach when doing anything that falls under the umbrella of creative coding, is to use a sine function, right? So the mathematical sine function, in order to introduce variation into a system. If you remember from math, the sine function looks like this, right? So it kind of goes up and then falls down and then up and down again. I don't even know the right terminology for this. That's how bad I am at math, but I use sine functions pretty often. Is it the period? I think it's the period of the function is pi, right? So it goes from 0 to pi in one full cycle of going up and down, and then it kind of repeats itself afterwards. So that's kind of all we need to know about the sine function. And what we want to do is, instead of having the width be equal, or like let's work with the height first. Instead of having the height be equal to 50 pixels every time, we're going to make it a function of the sine of the client X of the event, right? So based on where we are on the page, we get the result of the sine for that position and turn that into a number of pixels. So I'm just going to say, I'm just going to create a variable for it. So I'll say var marker height is equal to, and then the sine function is math.sine. We want to take the sine of, let's just say event.clientX, right? So how much to the left or to the right we are on the page. And the sine function returns a number between -1 and 1, right? However, if we just had a height of 1, that would be probably too small for the user to see. So we kind of want to like turn this -1 to 1 interval into something more like from 5 to 15, right? And the way to do that could be by, let's say we add 5, right? So 5 is the minimum height that we want, right? So right now it's going to be 5 minus 1 to 5 plus 1, so 4 to 6. We're gonna take care of that minus 1 in a second. And then we also want to kind of expand the range of the sign. And we can just do that by multiplying it with a number, right? So we have the minus 1 to 1 interval. If we multiply that by, let's say, 7, we're going to have from minus 7 to 7. Right, so it's minus 7 to 7 plus 5, which makes it minus 2 to 12. We should be in the positive range, so I'm going to actually change this to 10. Right, so now we're going from from 3 to 13. And let's plug this marker height into our height property. So I'm just gonna say marker height plus pixels. Okay, so now see how the height of our marker is sort of modulating based on where we are on the page. We could make it even, like, we can just kind of tweak these numbers. You can, like, feel free to play with them and see what happens. We can make it even taller, right? Like, make the modulation, let's say 20 and the minimum of 30. So this would go from 30 minus 20 to 30 plus 20, right? So 10 to 50, which is even more interesting. And you see the positions now look kind of arbitrary. It doesn't look at all like the smooth sine function that we were looking at in the example before. And that's kind of because this client X, it increases by 1 at every step, right? So like one pixel gives us 1 increase of client X. However, an increase of 1 in the sine function means a lot of difference between the results, right? Like the sine function goes a full cycle of up and down from 0 to pi, right? So from 0 to 3, or like to 3.14. So an increase of 1 is actually a huge change. But if we divided this event.clientX by, let's say, 10, right, that would kind of zoom in onto our function, and we would see more of the kind of sine curve that we see in the graph. If we divided it by an even larger number, let's say 50, that would give us an even slower change in the curve, right? So we're kind of changing the frequency of the sine function right now. I'll keep it at maybe, let's say 20. Yeah, that looks good enough to me. And let's do the same thing for the width and see what happens. Right, so we have the marker height, and then for the marker width, I'll just copy the same thing, the same variable, change its name to marker width. And then I'm actually going to use the cosine function, which is kind of the inverse of the sine function, has the same shape, but it's a little bit delayed. So cosine function, I guess we can just keep the event.clientX, and let's make this one smaller. Let's make it from, I don't know, I'll place a 10 in here and maybe a variation of 7. And let's update the actual width of the HTML elements to our new variable. So marker width plus pixels. All right, so now we're getting a little bit more diverse behavior, right? Like you see, sometimes they're kind of fat, sometimes they're kind of thin. Yeah, feel free to play with these numbers, with these variables, plug different things inside of those sine and cosine functions, and see how that affects the composition. Great. One more thing that I wanted to show in this tutorial is how to actually turn this into a drawing app, right? So right now, the things get drawn on canvas whenever I move my mouse. However, in a drawing app, what you do is that you need to click, and only when you click, things are being drawn. And if you're not clicking, you can just move your mouse freely without anything happening on screen. And it's actually pretty simple to turn this code into that. All we need to do is kind of keep track of when the mouse is clicked or when it's not. Uh, Fortunately, JavaScript has another event for us for that. It's called the mouse down event, right? So last time we looked at the click event, which kind of tells you when the user has clicked. Mouse down and its pair mouse up tells us when the user has clicked on the mouse and then when the user has released the mouse, right? So the mouse kind of has two actions, the pressing and then the releasing. Mouse down gives us the event fires at the moment when the user has clicked on the mouse. So what we need to do is to plug into this mouse down and mouse up events and set a flag to keep track of whether the mouse is pressed. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to add event listeners for those two events first. So we're going to say container element add event listener mouse down on mouse down, and then we're going to create that function, and then we're going to add the same kind of listener for mouse up, and we're going to say on mouse up. Let's create these functions, and then we're going to actually implement the logic in there. So function on mouse down, we'll take the event as an argument, but I don't think we're going to do anything with it. And then function on mouse up, and then again we'll take the event as an argument, and nothing's going to happen with it. So let's print these to the console. On mouse down, and then same thing for mouse up. Okay, so it's going to be a little bit hard to see these because I don't have, you can't see when I'm clicking, but I will say. So now I'm pressing on the mouse button, I'm still holding it down, and now I've just released it, right? So whenever I press it, we get the mouse down. Whenever I release it, we get the mouse up, right? So in order to detect when the user is holding the mouse down, that's kind of what happens in between these two events, right? So the drawing should be happening only if we are after mouse down, but before mouse up. And in order to kind of capture this moment between mouse down and mouse up, we can just create a variable. We'll create a global variable at the very top. We'll just say var is mouse pressed, and we'll initialize it to false. It's going to be a Boolean variable, a true false variable. And we want our drawing to only happen if the mouse is pressed, right? So we're going to put all of this code, all of the drawing code inside of an if statement, right? So we'll say if is mouse pressed, then do all of this stuff, right? Which is the drawing in itself. Right now nothing is going to show up because this mouse press starts as false, right? So that's always going to be false, and we're never going to draw. And what we want to do is to set is mouse pressed to true inside of the mouse down event, right? So when we press, we just set the variable to true and set it to false on the mouse up event, right? So kind of flag that the user is not clicking on the mouse anymore. So right now, if I move my mouse over the canvas, actually let's go in the big one. If I move my mouse over the canvas, nothing is happening. However, when I start clicking and dragging the mouse around, we see some drawing happening, right? So this is one way of turning HTML into a drawing canvas. I need to say here that this is not the most efficient way to draw with HTML. I was mentioning it last time in class. There is the HTML canvas element, which allows for doing this way more efficiently. We're not going to cover it in this class, but if you're interested in this kind of visual compositions, please check it out. Because the way this works, if we look into the inspector of our page, we see so many div elements, right? Like these are all the divs that we are creating inside of our mousemove event handler, and the moment the page starts getting too many divs, it's just going to become slow, right? And that's a problem that doesn't really happen with the canvas element that I was talking about. All right, very cool. I think we're almost done. One final thing I want to try, I haven't tried this before, I'm curious what happens. We could also draw with different elements, right? Like if we change this div into a button, I think, yeah, we will start drawing with button elements, which is super weird. And we can click on any of them, which I think is kind of fun. Could change it to iframe, which is also super weird. This also becomes really slow because iframes are kind of like big and clunky in terms of performance. We could change it to the input element and draw with a bunch of input boxes, and then we can also type inside of them. Right, so pretty much any HTML element that exists can be used for doing this kind of an interaction. All right, I think I'm gonna stop here with this tutorial. I hope this is fun. I hope the sine and cosine stuff makes sense. If it doesn't, feel free to reach out and we can talk more about it. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you.